The chamber doors slammed shut behind me before I had even taken my seat, and every eye in that vast circular hall turned to stare at me like I was something that had crawled out of a drain. I am Daniel Hart, and on that day, I was the only human sitting among representatives of 11 other species, all of them older than my entire civilization, all of them convinced that Earth did not belong in that room at all. The delegate from the Vren cluster, a tall creature with silver skin and eyes like polished stones, was mid-sentence when I walked in, and he did not bother to soften his words for my benefit. The human colony at Halvorn Reach was struck because it was undefended and unregistered, he said, his voice carrying easily across the chamber. This is not an attack. This is a correction of territorial oversight. I felt my hands curl into fists under the table. Halvorn Reach was not some undefended rock. It was home to 4,000 people, families who had left Earth to build something new among the stars, trusting that the Galactic Council would protect them the same way it claimed to protect every other member species. Trusting was clearly a mistake. 4,000 of my people are dead, I said, and my voice cracked the silence of the chamber like a dropped glass. You call that a correction? The Vren delegate did not even look at me directly. He addressed the council instead, as if I had not spoken at all. The human species has held a seat at this table for less than a decade. Their emotional reactions are understandable, but they do not change the legal standing of the Halvorn system, which was never formally claimed under council law. I looked around the chamber, searching for even one face that showed some flicker of sympathy, some sign that anyone here saw those 4,000 people as more than a footnote in a border dispute. I found nothing. The Alaxian ambassador studied her datapad. The Threll representative twitched his antennae in what I now understood to be their version of boredom. Even the delegates who were supposedly allied with Earth kept their eyes low, unwilling to challenge the Vren Empire over something as small, in their eyes, as a human colony. This was not the first time I had felt this particular kind of silence pressing down on me. From the very first day humanity joined the Council, we had been treated as guests who had wandered into a party we were not invited to. Our ships were called primitive. Our history was called violent and unstable, as though the wars we fought against each other centuries ago somehow disqualified us from being taken seriously now. Our lifespans, barely a blink compared to some of the older species in that room, were treated as a kind of joke, something to be mentioned with a polite smile before the real conversation continued without us. I had absorbed all of it quietly for years. I had sat through meetings where our proposals were dismissed before I finished presenting them. I had watched our ambassadors ignored in favor of species with more impressive technology or longer histories. I had told myself that patience was a virtue, that humanity needed time to earn respect, that we were the newcomers, and newcomers had to prove themselves. But 4,000 people were dead, and the council was debating property law. The Halvorn system was surveyed and settled by human engineers 8 years ago, I said, forcing calm into my voice even though my chest felt tight enough to crack. Registration documents were filed with this very council. I have copies here. I placed a small data crystal on the table in front of me, and it projected a holographic display of the filing records, dates, signatures, everything in perfect order. For a moment, the chamber went quiet in a different way, the kind of quiet that comes when someone has been caught, rather than the kind that comes from indifference. The Vren delegate recovered quickly. Filings can be lost in transit. Bureaucratic systems are imperfect. This does not change the fact that no formal defense treaty existed for that system, which means the Vren fleet acted within its rights to secure a resource dispute in contested space. Contested space. That was the phrase they always used when they wanted to take something that was not theirs. I had heard it applied to human colonies before, always quietly, always in situations where the council somehow found a technicality that favored the larger, older empires over the newer, smaller ones. It was beginning to feel less like an accident and more like a pattern. I looked toward the human seat beside me, where our senior ambassador, a steady woman named Claire Bennett, sat with her jaw locked tight. She had been navigating this council for longer than I had, and I could see in her eyes that she already knew how this session would end. The council would issue a statement expressing concern. They would recommend dialogue. They would ask both sides to show restraint. And nothing would actually happen, because nothing ever did when the aggressor was powerful enough to make consequences inconvenient. "What do you want us to do?" Claire whispered to me while the debate continued around us. "File another complaint that goes nowhere?" I did not answer her right away, because a small part of me was still trying to hold on to the hope that this council, whatever its flaws, would eventually do the right thing. That hope had carried humanity through years of small insults and larger injustices. I had believed, perhaps naively, that patience and diplomacy would eventually earn us a seat that mattered, not just a seat that existed. The session dragged on for another hour, filled with careful language and diplomatic phrases designed to avoid actually deciding anything. In the end, the council issued exactly what Claire predicted: a statement of concern, a call for both parties to pursue peaceful resolution, and a promise to revisit the matter at a future session. No sanctions against the Vren Empire. No emergency relief for the survivors of Halvorn Reach. No accountability at all. As the chamber began to empty, the Vren delegate walked past our table, and for the first time that day, he looked directly at me. There was no anger in his expression, no malice even. Just a kind of tired amusement, the look one might give a child who had made a fuss over nothing important. "Your species will learn," he said quietly, "that some rules exist for everyone, and some rules exist only for those who can enforce them." He walked away before I could respond, and I stood there in the emptying chamber, with my hands still curled into fists, staring at the empty space where 4,000 names should have meant something. I did not go back to my quarters that night. Instead, I walked the long observation corridor that wrapped around the outer ring of the council station, staring out at the stars scattered endlessly beyond the reinforced viewport. Somewhere out there, families on a dozen other human colonies were going about their evenings, unaware that the very institution meant to protect them had just decided their safety was a matter of interpretation. Claire found me there an hour later, her footsteps quiet against the metal floor. "You did well in there," she said, though her tone suggested she did not entirely believe her own words. "Better than most first-year delegates would have managed." "It didn't change anything," I said. "No," she admitted, "it didn't." We stood in silence for a while, watching the light of distant stars ripple against the viewport glass. I thought about the message I had received 2 days earlier from Halvorn Reach, sent just hours before the attack began, a routine update about crop yields and school enrollment numbers, written by a colony administrator named Ethan Cole, who I had exchanged messages with for years but never met in person. That message was likely the last thing he ever sent. I wondered if he had known, even for a moment, that no one was coming to help him. "They think we don't have the will to respond," I said finally. "They think because we're new here, because we don't have their history of quiet compliance, that we'll just accept whatever they decide to hand us." Claire turned to look at me, and there was something new in her expression, something I had not seen from her before. Not despair. Something closer to resolve. "Maybe they're right about one thing," she said. "We don't have their history. We have our own." I did not fully understand what she meant that night, standing in that quiet corridor, with the weight of Halvorn Reach pressing down on both of us. But I would understand soon enough, because word was already spreading through the human quarter of the station, message by message, colony by colony, that the council had failed us again, and that this time Earth was not going to wait patiently for permission to defend what was ours. 3 days later, I received a summons back to Earth itself, a planet I had not set foot on in over a year. The message came from the office of the Global Defense Coordination Authority, signed by a name I recognized but had never worked with directly, a woman named Grace Whitfield who oversaw human military strategy across all our colonies and fleets. The summons contained no explanation, only a single line that stayed with me during the entire journey home. "It is time you understood what your species is truly capable of when it stops asking for permission." I did not sleep well during that trip. Something in the wording of that message felt different from anything I had encountered in my years working with the council, something quieter and more certain, the tone of people who had already made a decision and were simply waiting for the right moment to act on it. I had spent years defending humanity in rooms full of skeptical aliens, arguing that we deserved respect, that we deserved patience, that given enough time we would prove ourselves worthy of a seat at that table. I did not yet know that the time for proving ourselves through patience had already ended, and that the proving humanity was about to do would look nothing like diplomacy at all. When my transport descended through Earth's atmosphere, and I saw the lights of home spread out below me, familiar and steady despite everything happening among the stars, I felt a strange mixture of comfort and dread. Comfort because I was finally back somewhere that made sense to me. Dread because I suspected, deep down, that the Earth I was returning to would not be the same one I had left. I was right. Nothing about what came next would be anything like what came before. The Global Defense Coordination Authority operated out of a facility buried beneath the mountains outside a city that used to be called Geneva, though almost nobody used that name anymore, since the region had been rebuilt and renamed after the reunification decades earlier. I had visited government buildings before, plenty of them, but nothing had prepared me for the atmosphere inside that mountain complex. There was no wasted motion here, no long committee debates, no polite language designed to avoid saying anything directly. Every person I passed in those corridors moved like they were already at war, even though, as far as I knew, no formal declaration had been made. Grace Whitfield met me in a briefing room deep within the facility, and she did not waste time on pleasantries. She was younger than I expected for someone holding her position, though her eyes carried the kind of tired weight that comes from carrying too much responsibility for too long. "You sat in that council chamber and watched them shrug off 4,000 deaths," she said before I had even taken my seat. "I want you to understand something, Daniel. That was not the first time. It was simply the first time you were close enough to see it happen." She activated a display on the wall, and I found myself looking at a map of human space. Dozens of small markers scattered across systems I recognized, and several I did not. Each marker, she explained, represented an incident the Council had quietly filed away over the past 6 years. Colonies raided for resources, trade convoys seized under manufactured legal pretexts, border skirmishes dismissed as misunderstandings. I had known about some of these incidents in a general sense, the way anyone following interstellar news might, but I had never seen them laid out together like this, an unmistakable pattern rather than a series of unfortunate coincidences. Why wasn't this brought to the full council before now? I asked, though even as the words left my mouth I suspected I already knew the answer. "It was," Grace said, "every single time, and every single time the outcome was the same, a statement of concern, a recommendation for dialogue, nothing that cost the aggressors anything." She paused, letting the weight of that settle over the room. "We tried patience, Daniel. We tried diplomacy for 6 years, while our colonies suffered quietly at the edges of known space. The Council was never going to protect us, because protecting us was never in their interest. Every empire on that council benefits from a galaxy where humanity stays small and grateful." I sat with that for a long moment, thinking about the Vren delegate's tired amusement, the way he had looked at me like I was a child who had not yet learned the real rules of the universe. Perhaps he was right that I had not learned them, but I was learning quickly now. "So what happens next?" I asked. Grace did not answer immediately. Instead, she gestured for me to follow her, leading me through a reinforced door into a much larger chamber, one I had not known existed within the facility. Inside, dozens of analysts and officers worked at stations arranged in concentric circles, screens filled with fleet deployments, supply chain calculations, and communication logs from colonies across human space. At the center of the room stood a holographic display showing something that made my breath catch in my throat, a coordinated deployment plan spanning nearly every human system, with fleet designations I had never encountered before. "We have spent 6 years building something the Council does not know exists," Grace said quietly, watching my reaction. While our diplomats smiled and nodded in their meetings, our engineers were designing new classes of ships. While our ambassadors accepted their polite dismissals, our shipyards were producing them faster than any council member believed possible. We did not build this to start a conflict, Daniel. We built it because we finally understood that no one else was going to stand between our colonies and the empires who saw us as an easy target. I stared at the deployment map, trying to process the scale of what I was seeing. Ship designations spread across a dozen sectors, supply lines connecting worlds I had visited as a diplomat and worlds I had never heard of before. This was not a defensive posture. This was the architecture of a species preparing to answer harm with something far more decisive than another strongly worded statement. "The Council will call this an act of aggression," I said. "The Council can call it whatever they like," Grace replied, and for the first time I heard something sharp beneath her calm exterior, a controlled frustration that had clearly been building for years. They had 6 years to call the loss of our colonies an act of aggression, and they chose instead to call it a border dispute. We are done asking them for permission to protect ourselves. Over the following days, I was given access to briefings I had never imagined would exist, each one revealing another layer of what humanity had quietly built while pretending, in every public forum, to be exactly the harmless newcomers the Council believed us to be. I learned about new propulsion systems that allowed our ships to maneuver in ways alien tacticians had not accounted for, developed by engineers who had studied every known Council fleet doctrine and built specifically to exploit their blind spots. I learned about communication networks designed to coordinate human fleets across vast distances with a speed that outpaced anything the older empires used, since those empires had grown complacent after centuries without serious challenge. I learned about training programs that treated every soldier not as a specialist locked into a narrow role, but as someone capable of adapting instantly when circumstances changed, because human history, complicated as it was, had taught us that rigid strategies collapse the moment reality refuses to follow the plan. What struck me most, though, was not the technology or the strategy. It was the people. I met young recruits who spoke about the coming conflict not with fear, but with a quiet determination that unsettled me more than any weapon could. I met engineers who had spent years designing systems they hoped would never need to be used, and who now spoke about deploying them with a mixture of sorrow and resolve. I met colony administrators who had lost friends and family members in incidents the Council had dismissed as misunderstandings, and who now sat in strategy meetings contributing knowledge of terrain and local conditions with a precision that came from having lived through exactly the kind of loss they were now determined to prevent from happening again. Grace introduced me to one of these administrators during my 3rd day at the facility, a woman named Amelia Ford, who had survived an earlier raid on a mining colony that the Council had quietly filed away as an unfortunate accident years before Halvorn Reach ever made headlines. She spoke about that day with a steadiness that told me she had rebuilt herself entirely around the memory of it, shaping her grief into something useful rather than letting it consume her. "I used to believe the Council would eventually notice us," she told me over a quiet meal in the facility's dining hall. "I believed if we just kept showing up, kept following their rules, kept proving we were worth respecting, they would eventually treat us as equals." She shook her head slowly. "It took me a long time to understand that respect earned through patience only works with people who are capable of shame. The empires on that Council are not ashamed of what they do to smaller species. They have simply never been forced to pay a price for it." I thought about the Vren delegate again, about his calm assurance that some rules exist only for those who can enforce them. Perhaps, I realized, humanity had spent years trying to prove we deserved a seat at a table built entirely around a different set of rules than the ones we had been raised to respect. Perhaps earning respect within that system had never been possible, because the system itself was designed to protect the interests of those who already held power. On my 5th day at the facility, an emergency alert interrupted a strategy briefing I was attending with Grace and several senior officers. A transmission had come through from a colony called Ashgrove Point, a small agricultural settlement near the edge of contested space that had been quietly building its own defense network for the past year under the authorities' guidance. The transmission was garbled, urgent, cut short by interference before the officer monitoring it could extract more than a few sentences. Ships had entered the system without authorization. The colony's defense grid had detected them attempting to jam local communications. The room went still for a moment, the kind of stillness that comes right before people move with absolute purpose. Grace turned to the ranking officer present, a man named Nathan Ellery, whose calm demeanor did not waver, even as the weight of the moment settled over the chamber. "Deploy the Ashgrove response fleet," she said, her voice carrying none of the hesitation I might have expected given the stakes. "Full engagement authorization. This time, we do not wait for the Council to acknowledge what is happening before we act." I watched as orders moved through the chamber with a speed and precision that told me this scenario, or something close to it, had been rehearsed extensively. Within minutes, updates began flowing in from the deployed fleet, coordinated communication that made it clear humanity's new command structure was operating exactly as designed. I felt something shift inside me as I watched those updates scroll across the displays, a mixture of anxiety and something else I had not expected to feel, a kind of fierce, protective pride in what my species had quietly built, while the rest of the galaxy assumed we were still the same uncertain newcomers who had joined their council with hopeful, naive expectations. Grace turned to me once the initial response had been confirmed, her expression unreadable, but her eyes carrying a weight that told me she understood exactly what this moment meant for humanity's future. "This is only the beginning, Daniel," she said quietly. "Ashgrove Point will not be the last test, and when the Council finally understands what we are capable of, they will wish they had listened to us 6 years ago instead of treating our patience as weakness." I did not sleep that night either, lying awake in the small quarters assigned to me within the facility, listening to the distant hum of machinery that never stopped, thinking about Ethan Cole's final message and the 4,000 names from Halvorn Reach that the Council had reduced to a footnote in a border dispute. I thought about Amelia Ford's quiet resolve, about the young recruits speaking with grim determination about a conflict they had not chosen but were now prepared to finish. I thought about the Vren delegate's tired amusement, his certainty that humanity would learn its place among the older, more powerful species of the galaxy. He was right that we were about to learn something. He simply had no idea yet what that lesson would actually be. The reports from Ashgrove Point arrived faster than I expected, and they told a story unlike anything the Council chamber had prepared me for. The intruding fleet belonged to a smaller faction aligned with the Vren Empire, sent to test whether humanity's outer colonies remained as poorly defended as intelligence reports suggested. They expected to find scattered ships and confused administrators, buying time for a diplomatic solution that would never arrive quickly enough to matter. Instead, they found a defense network that had been quietly built and tested for over a year, coordinated by officers trained to abandon rigid formations the moment those formations stopped working. Nathan Ellery walked me through the engagement afterward, his voice steady but carrying a note of something close to satisfaction. They came expecting a slow, formal negotiation while their ship sat in orbit collecting data, he said, pulling up a recorded tactical display. Instead, our response fleet engaged within 4 minutes of detection, using approach vectors their sensors were not calibrated to track efficiently. By the time their commanders adjusted their strategy, half their formation had already been forced into a retreat pattern. I watched the recording with a strange mixture of relief and unease. There was no ceremony to what I saw, no dramatic declarations, only calculated, overwhelming coordination that left the intruding fleet with no good options. Several of their ships suffered disabling damage. The rest withdrew from the system entirely, likely carrying reports back to their command structure that would confuse and alarm anyone still operating under the assumption that humanity remained an easy target. "No casualties on our side," Nathan added, watching my reaction carefully. "Not because we were fortunate, but because we planned for this exact scenario for over a year. This is what patience actually looks like, Daniel. Not waiting quietly while others decide our fate. Preparing quietly until we no longer need permission to protect ourselves." Word of the Ashgrove engagement spread through Council channels within days, though the reports that reached the wider galaxy were fragmented and confused, since the Vren Empire had no interest in advertising a failed operation. Still, rumors circulated among the smaller species represented on the council, whispers that something had shifted in how humanity responded to provocation. I noticed it myself during a brief communication exchange with Claire Bennett, who remained at the council station monitoring the political fallout. "They are asking questions now," she told me over a secure channel, her expression carrying a cautious optimism I had not seen from her since before Halvorn Reach. Species who never bothered acknowledging our existence before are suddenly requesting private meetings. They want to know what happened at Ashgrove Point. They want to know if the rumors are true. "What are you telling them?" I asked. "Nothing," she said, and for the first time I heard something like amusement in her voice. "Let them wonder." The Vren Empire, however, did not wonder for long. Within 2 weeks, intelligence reports confirmed what Grace and her strategists had anticipated. The Empire was preparing a larger response, unwilling to accept that a single failed raid represented anything more than an unfortunate tactical miscalculation. Their leadership, according to intercepted communications, still believed humanity's success at Ashgrove Point was a fluke, a lucky combination of circumstances rather than evidence of a fundamentally different approach to warfare. Grace called an emergency briefing the day the intelligence came through, gathering senior officers and a handful of colony representatives, myself included, into the central command chamber. The mood in the room was different from anything I had felt since arriving at the facility, a mixture of readiness and quiet gravity that told me everyone present understood what was coming. "The Vren fleet is assembling near their border with contested space," Grace said, gesturing toward a display showing fleet movements gathered from long-range sensors and allied intelligence sources. Their target appears to be the Corvale system, a cluster of 3 human colonies that together represent nearly 500,000 people. 500,000 people. I felt the number settle into my chest like a stone, heavier than any statistic I had encountered during my years as a diplomat. Halvorn Reach had cost 4,000 lives, and the Council had reduced it to a footnote. Corvale represented more than 100 times that number, and I understood immediately that this was not a probing raid like Ashgrove Point. This was meant to be decisive, a demonstration of force intended to remind humanity of its place among the older empires. "What is our response?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer given everything I had witnessed over the past 2 weeks. Grace turned to Nathan, who activated a new display showing an extensive deployment plan spanning multiple sectors, ships converging from angles I would not have expected given the distances involved. "We do not wait for them to arrive at Corvale," Nathan said. "We intercept their fleet before it reaches the system, using coordinated strikes from 3 separate directions simultaneously. Their command structure relies on centralized decision-making, which means disrupting their communication network early will slow their ability to adapt." I listened as the strategists outlined a plan that bore no resemblance to the cautious, defensive posture humanity had maintained during our early years on the Council. This was aggressive, calculated, and built entirely around exploiting weaknesses the Vren Empire had never needed to address before, since no species had challenged their dominance directly in generations. Their fleet doctrine assumed opponents would either retreat or engage in predictable, formal patterns designed to minimize losses on both sides. Humanity's strategists had studied that assumption carefully and built a plan specifically designed to violate it. "This will not be a small engagement," Grace said, addressing the room with a gravity that silenced whatever quiet conversation remained. "If our intelligence is accurate, we are looking at the largest deployment of human forces since our species left Earth's solar system. I want everyone here to understand what that means. This is not another test. This is the moment the Council will finally understand that humanity is not a species they can dismiss or exploit any longer." I spent the following 3 days moving between briefings, communication centers, and quiet moments of reflection that I did not fully understand until much later. I thought often about Ethan Cole and the message he sent me just before Halvorn Reach fell silent, wondering whether the families of Corvale were sending similarly ordinary messages to loved ones, unaware of what was approaching their system. I thought about Amelia Ford's quiet resolve, about how grief could be reshaped into determination without losing its weight entirely. I thought about the Vren delegate's tired certainty that humanity would eventually learn its place, and I found myself wondering what expression he would wear when he learned exactly how wrong he had been. On the third day, I was given an assignment I had not expected. Grace wanted me aboard one of the coordination vessels overseeing the Corvale engagement, not as a soldier, since I had no combat training to speak of, but as an observer whose diplomatic background would allow me to document the engagement accurately for the Council's eventual reckoning with what humanity had become. You sat in that chamber and watched them dismiss 4,000 deaths as a border dispute, Grace told me as I prepared to depart. I want you to sit somewhere else this time, somewhere you can watch what happens when they finally push us past the point of quiet endurance. Someone needs to carry an honest account of this back to that chamber, Daniel. I trust you to do that. The coordination vessel, a large support ship named the Meridian Watch, carried a crew of officers, analysts, and technical specialists overseeing the broader engagement from a position removed from direct combat, but close enough to monitor everything in real time. I was given a station near the command deck, close enough to observe the unfolding operation without interfering with the officers managing it. As our fleet moved toward its intercept position, I found myself speaking with a young communications officer named Sophie Ainsley, who had grown up on one of the Corvale colonies before enlisting several years earlier. She spoke quietly about her family still living there, her voice carrying a controlled tension that told me she understood exactly what was at stake in the coming engagement, perhaps more personally than anyone else aboard the vessel. "My parents don't know any of this is happening," she told me, her eyes fixed on the tactical display showing our fleet's approach vectors. The colony administrators were told to maintain normal operations, no evacuation warnings, nothing that might tip off Vren intelligence sources monitoring the system. "That seems like a difficult decision," I said carefully. "It was," she admitted, "but if we intercept their fleet before it reaches Corvale, none of them will ever know how close they came to becoming another footnote in a council session. If we fail, the evacuation warning would not have saved them anyway, not against a fleet that size." She paused, her hand steady on her console despite the weight of what she had just said. "I would rather trust the plan than spend these last hours in a panic no one has time for." I admired her steadiness in that moment, understanding for the first time on a personal level what Grace and the other strategists had built over 6 years of quiet preparation. This was not simply a matter of ships and weapons and tactical doctrine. It was thousands of individual people, each carrying their own private stakes into an engagement that would determine far more than the fate of one system. As our fleet approached the intercept coordinates, the command deck grew quiet in a way that reminded me of the stillness inside the council chamber just before a vote, except this silence carried none of that chamber's indifference. Every person aboard the Meridian Watch understood exactly what depended on the coming hours, and I felt, for the first time since Halvorn Reach, a version of hope that did not depend on anyone else's permission to exist. The Vren fleet appeared on our sensors roughly 6 hours into our approach, moving in the confident, unhurried formation of a force that expected no real resistance before reaching its target. I watched Nathan's voice come through the command channel, calm and precise, giving the order that would begin the engagement humanity had spent 6 years quietly preparing for. "All fleets, execute intercept pattern. Let them see exactly what waiting patiently has cost them." The moment the intercept order came through, the Meridian Watch's command deck transformed from quiet tension into focused, silent motion. I had expected shouting, urgency bordering on panic, the kind of chaos I had seen depicted in old dramatizations of battles from Earth's history. Instead, I witnessed something closer to a symphony, dozens of officers moving through practiced coordination, their voices low and steady as they relayed updates across the fleet network. Sophie Ainsley's hands moved across her console with a precision that betrayed none of the personal stakes she carried into this engagement. Through the tactical display, I watched 3 separate human fleet formations converge on the Vren force from angles their sensors had not fully accounted for. a maneuver Nathan had explained to me days earlier as being built specifically around exploiting the older empire's reliance on predictable, formal engagement patterns. The Vren commanders reacted quickly once they registered the scale of what approached them, but their reaction came several crucial minutes later than it needed to. Nathan's voice remained steady across the command channel as he adjusted our fleet's positioning in response to their attempted countermaneuver. "Their communication relay ships are falling back toward the center of their formation," he said. "That confirms our intelligence. Their command structure depends entirely on centralized coordination. Focus disruption efforts there first." I watched as a coordinated group of smaller human vessels, designed specifically for this kind of precision work, moved to isolate the Vren fleet's communication and coordination ships from the rest of their formation. Within minutes, the confident, unified movement of the Vren fleet began to fracture into smaller, uncertain clusters, commanders no longer receiving clear direction from their central authority, forced instead to make individual decisions without the coordination their doctrine had always relied upon. "They're not adapting," Sophie said quietly, watching the same display I was. "They don't know how." She was right. I watched engagement after engagement unfold across the tactical display, each one following a similar pattern. Vren vessels, trained for generations to fight according to established, almost ceremonial rules of engagement, found themselves facing human ships that refused to follow any pattern they recognized. Where the Vren doctrine called for formal exchanges at measured distances, human pilots closed the distance rapidly, exploiting maneuverability advantages their opponents had never needed to develop countermeasures for. Where Vren commanders expected opposing forces to retreat once losses reached a certain threshold, human fleets pressed forward with a persistence that seemed to genuinely unsettle their opponents. 3 hours into the engagement, the Vren fleet's formation had fractured entirely, their remaining ships scattered and attempting independent withdrawal rather than any coordinated retreat. I watched the casualty reports scroll across a secondary display and felt a complicated mixture of relief and unease settle over me as I processed the numbers. Human losses remained remarkably low, a testament to the years of careful preparation Grace and her strategists had invested in this moment. The Vren losses, by contrast, were significant, their fleet reduced to a fraction of its original strength by the time the last of their ships disengaged and retreated toward friendly territory. I felt no satisfaction watching those numbers, only a heavy awareness of what this engagement represented. Somewhere among those retreating Vren ships were commanders who would need to explain to their leadership exactly how a species they considered primitive had systematically dismantled a fleet built around centuries of established military doctrine. I thought about the 4,000 people lost at Halvorn Reach, about Ethan Cole's final ordinary message, and I understood that whatever unease I felt now did not erase the necessity of what had just happened. It simply meant I carried the weight of it honestly, rather than pretending this victory came without cost or consequence. Nathan's voice came through the command channel once the last Vren ship had disengaged, carrying a controlled steadiness that told me he understood the significance of the moment better than anyone aboard. "Corvale's system remains secure," he announced. "All colonies report normal operations, no awareness of how close this engagement came to reaching their airspace. Casualties among our forces are within acceptable parameters. Full reports will be compiled for authority review within the hour." A quiet murmur of relief passed through the command deck, though it carried none of the celebratory energy I might have expected. Instead, I sensed a collective understanding among the crew that this engagement, however successful, represented only the beginning of something far larger. Sophie turned to me, her expression carrying a complicated mixture of relief and exhaustion. "They'll send a larger fleet next time," she said quietly. "This was meant to be a demonstration of force. Now they'll want to demonstrate something even larger to save face." She was right, though none of us fully understood yet how quickly the Vren Empire would respond, or how the wider council would react, once word of the Corvale engagement reached the chamber where I had once sat listening to delegates dismiss human losses as bureaucratic technicalities. Word reached the council within 4 days. Though the initial reports were fragmented and contradictory, since the Vren Empire had every incentive to minimize the scale of their defeat. Claire contacted me through a secure channel shortly after the reports began circulating, her voice carrying a controlled excitement that told me the political landscape aboard the Council station had shifted dramatically in a very short time. "They are panicking," she told me. "The Vren delegation is claiming the reports are exaggerated, that this was a minor skirmish rather than a full engagement. But 3 other delegations have already requested independent verification, and one of them has quietly reached out to us directly, asking whether humanity would be interested in a private strategic discussion." "Which delegation?" I asked. "The Threll representative," she said, and I felt genuine surprise at the name. The Threll had never shown particular interest in humanity before, treating our presence on the Council with the same detached indifference as most other established species. Apparently watching a species they considered harmless dismantle a Vren battle fleet has changed their calculations considerably. I thought about the Threll representative's antennae twitching with boredom during the Halvorn Reach session, and felt a strange, complicated satisfaction at the idea of that same delegate now scrambling to reassess an entire diplomatic strategy built around underestimating humanity. The Vren Empire's response came faster than anyone at the Authority had anticipated. Within 2 weeks of the Corvale engagement, intelligence reports confirmed a massive fleet mobilization, far larger than anything committed to the earlier operation. Grace called an emergency briefing the moment the reports were confirmed, and I could see immediately that this news carried a different weight than anything we had faced before. "This is not a demonstration anymore," she told the assembled officers and representatives. "Their leadership has committed to what appears to be their entire border fleet, along with reinforcements drawn from at least 2 allied systems. Their target, according to intercepted communications, is not a single colony cluster this time. It is Earth's outer defense perimeter itself." The room absorbed this information with a heavy silence. I understood immediately what this meant. The Vran Empire, humiliated by their defeat at Corvale, had decided that only a decisive strike against humanity's core territory would restore their standing among the Council's older powers. This was no longer a conflict fought at the edges of human space. This was a fight for the safety of Earth itself, and everyone in that room understood the stakes had shifted accordingly. "What is our response?" I asked, though the question felt almost redundant given everything I had witnessed over the preceding weeks. Grace turned toward the strategic display, where an enormous deployment plan already awaited activation, drawing together nearly every fleet humanity had quietly constructed over 6 years of patient preparation. "We do not wait for them at our doorstep," she said. "Every fleet we possess will converge at the outer defense line, coordinated through the same communication network that succeeded at Ashgrove and Corvale, scaled to a magnitude we have never attempted before. This will be the largest engagement in human history, and it will determine whether the Council continues to see us as a species that can be exploited, or finally understands that era has ended permanently." Over the following days, I watched humanity's defense network mobilize on a scale that defied everything I understood about our supposed limitations as a young species among ancient empires. Ships that had been quietly stationed across dozens of systems began converging toward Earth's outer perimeter, coordinated through communication protocols that allowed near instantaneous strategic adjustments across the entire fleet. I met commanders who had spent years training for exactly this scenario, engineers who had designed weapon systems specifically calibrated to counter Vren fleet doctrine, and civilian volunteers who had left their ordinary lives behind to support the largest mobilization effort our species had ever undertaken. Amelia Ford, whom I had not seen since our conversation weeks earlier at the Authority facility, found me during the final briefing before the fleet's departure toward the defense line. She had volunteered to serve aboard one of the coordination vessels, drawing on her experience surviving the earlier raid that the Council had dismissed years before Halvorn Reach ever made headlines. "I never thought I would see this day," she told me quietly, watching the deployment maps update in real time. "For years I believed we would simply keep absorbing losses until we either disappeared entirely or finally earned enough patience points to matter. I never imagined we would build something capable of standing against an entire empire's border fleet. Are you afraid? I asked her honestly. She considered the question for a long moment before answering. I was afraid for years, watching colonies disappear one by one while the council debated jurisdiction. This is different. This is the first time in a long while that I feel like fear is finally pointed in the right direction, toward the people who caused it, rather than toward an uncertain future we had no control over. I carried her words with me as I boarded the Meridian Watch once again, joining Sophie Ainsley and the same coordination crew who had guided humanity through the Corvale engagement weeks earlier. The mood aboard the vessel was different this time, heavier, with the understanding that whatever happened at Earth's defense perimeter would echo across the entire galaxy, reshaping how every species on the Council understood humanity's place among them. As our fleet approached the coordinates where the defense line would form, I found myself standing near the observation viewport, watching thousands of human vessels arrange themselves into a formation more massive than anything I had previously witnessed. Grace's voice came through the fleet-wide communication channel shortly before the Vren fleet's arrival was projected, carrying a steadiness that reached every ship in that vast formation. For 6 years we built this in silence, while the Council decided our losses were not worth their attention, she said. Today, they will finally understand exactly what patience looks like when a species has simply been waiting for the moment they no longer need permission to protect what belongs to them. Hold formation, trust your training, and let them see, finally, what they have spent years underestimating. The Vren fleet appeared on our sensors roughly 2 hours later, a formation so vast it seemed to stretch endlessly across the tactical display, easily 3 times the size of the force we had defeated at Corvale. For a moment, watching that overwhelming number approach Earth's defense perimeter, I felt a flicker of doubt creep into my chest, wondering whether even 6 years of careful preparation could truly withstand a force of this magnitude. Then I remembered Ethan Cole's final message, the 4,000 names reduced to a footnote, and Amelia Ford's quiet certainty that fear finally pointed in the right direction. I understood, watching that massive fleet approach, that humanity had not built this defense network out of aggression or ambition. We had built it because 6 years of patient diplomacy had taught us that no one else would ever stand between our colonies and those who sought to exploit our patience as weakness. Nathan's voice came through the command channel one final time before the engagement began, calm and certain despite the overwhelming scale of what approached us. All fleets, hold position, let them come to us, and let them learn exactly what happens when Earth finally stops asking permission to defend what is ours. The engagement at Earth's defense perimeter began with a silence I had not expected, thousands of vessels holding position with a discipline that seemed almost unnatural given the scale of the force approaching us. I stood near the observation viewport aboard the Meridian Watch, watching the Vren fleet grow larger on the tactical display with every passing minute, and I found myself gripping the railing tightly enough that my knuckles turned pale. Sophie Ainsley remained at her console nearby, her expression carrying the same controlled focus I had witnessed during the Corvale engagement, though I could see something heavier settling behind her eyes this time. This was no longer a distant colony cluster at stake. This was Earth itself, the world where her family had grown up long before she left for Corvale, the world every person aboard this vessel called home in some fundamental way, regardless of where they had been born. "They're holding formation at extreme range," she said quietly, watching the Vren fleet's approach pattern, testing our response before committing fully. Nathan's voice came through the command channel, steady despite the pressure of the moment. "Let them test. We hold position until they commit to an approach vector." I understood, watching the display, that this restraint was itself a form of strategy, one built around forcing the Vren commanders to make the first definitive move, revealing their intentions before humanity committed our own forces to a specific response. The Vren fleet, still operating under assumptions shaped by generations of formal, predictable engagement doctrine, eventually advanced in a wide, encircling formation clearly designed to overwhelm our defense line through sheer numerical superiority. "There it is," Nathan said, satisfaction evident beneath his controlled tone. Execute counterformation. Let their numbers become their weakness rather than their strength. What followed was unlike anything the historical records I had studied during my diplomatic training had prepared me to witness. Rather than meeting the Vren fleet's encircling formation with a matching wide defense, humanity's ships collapsed into a series of smaller, highly coordinated clusters, each one capable of independent tactical decisions while remaining connected through the same instantaneous communication network that had proven so effective at Corvale. As the Vren formation attempted to close their encirclement, they found themselves fighting not one unified defense line, but dozens of smaller, unpredictable engagements scattered across the perimeter, each one adapting faster than their centralized command structure could process. I watched the tactical display with a mixture of awe and unease as hour after hour passed, the engagement stretching far longer than either Ashgrove or Corvale had required. Casualty reports scrolled across secondary displays, and I forced myself to read them honestly rather than looking away, understanding that whatever came from this battle deserved to be witnessed clearly rather than filtered through comfortable distance. Human losses, while heavier than the previous engagements, remained proportionally far smaller than the losses mounting within the Vren formation, whose rigid doctrine continued to struggle against tactics their training had never prepared them to counter. Midway through the engagement, Grace's voice came through the command channel, addressing the entire fleet with the same steady clarity she had carried since the day I first met her. Vren command ships are attempting to consolidate their remaining forces into a final concentrated strike toward Earth's inner defenses, she said. This is the moment their leadership committed everything to. Do not let them reach that threshold. I watched as human fleet commanders redirected their forces with a speed that seemed to defy the scale of coordination required, converging from multiple directions to intercept the Vren consolidation attempt before it could gain momentum. Sophie's hands moved rapidly across her console, relaying updated positioning data that allowed our scattered clusters to reform into a concentrated response at exactly the moment it was needed most. The final hours of the engagement unfolded with a brutal clarity that left no room for the kind of ambiguous, technicality-laden interpretation the Council had applied to Halvorn Reach. The Vren fleet's attempted consolidation collapsed under coordinated human counterattacks, their remaining ships scattering into disorganized retreat as their command structure finally broke down entirely. By the time the last Vren vessel disengaged and fled toward the safety of contested space, their once overwhelming force had been reduced to a fraction of its original strength, a defeat so total that even the most skeptical council delegations would find it impossible to dismiss as exaggerated rumor. Nathan's voice came through the command channel one final time, carrying an exhaustion that told me even he had not fully anticipated the scale of what humanity had just accomplished. Earth's defense perimeter remains secure, he announced. Vren fleet in full retreat. All human forces report casualties within survivable parameters. This engagement is concluded. A profound stillness settled over the Meridian Watch's command deck, not the celebratory relief I might have expected, but something heavier and more complicated, the recognition that humanity had just permanently altered its position within the galaxy through a cost that would echo for generations. Sophie turned away from her console for the first time since the engagement began, her eyes glistening with an exhaustion that carried both relief and grief for whatever losses had occurred during those long hours. "It's over," she said quietly, though her tone suggested she understood, as I did, that this victory marked a beginning as much as an ending. The news of humanity's defense of Earth spread through council channels within hours, this time carrying none of the ambiguity that had surrounded the Corvale engagement. Independent verification came quickly from multiple delegations who had maintained long-range monitoring stations near human space, confirming that the Vren Empire had committed its entire border fleet to the operation and suffered a defeat so complete that their military standing among the Council's established powers would take years, if not decades, to recover. Claire contacted me the moment I returned to Earth, her expression carrying an intensity I had never witnessed from her during our years working together at the Council Station. "You need to see this," she said, activating a recorded transmission from the most recent council session. "The chamber has never been like this before." The recording showed a scene entirely unlike the dismissive, indifferent atmosphere I remembered from the session following Halvorn Reach. Delegates who had once ignored human representatives entirely now sat in visibly tense silence as the Vren delegate, no longer carrying his familiar tired amusement, attempted to explain his empire's catastrophic losses to a chamber that had clearly lost patience with his explanations. Several delegations openly questioned whether the Vren Empire's aggressive posture toward humanity had been sanctioned through any legitimate council process, or whether it represented an unauthorized unilateral action that had now brought disgrace upon their entire diplomatic standing. The Threll delegation formally requested a review of every incident involving human colonies over the past 6 years, Claire told me, pausing the recording. The same incidents they dismissed without comment when you first raised them in that chamber. They are asking now, publicly, why the Council failed to act when clear evidence existed of a sustained pattern of aggression against a member species. I felt something complicated settle in my chest listening to her account, a mixture of vindication and a lingering ache for everything it had taken to reach this moment. 4,000 people at Halvorn Reach, countless others across the incidents scattered through Grace's early briefing map. All of them had died while the Council debated jurisdiction and technicalities, and only now, after humanity had demonstrated a capability for decisive, overwhelming response, did those same delegations suddenly discover their concern for justice. "What happens to the Vren Empire now?" I asked. "Their standing has collapsed," Claire said. "Several of their allied systems have already begun distancing themselves diplomatically, unwilling to be associated with an empire humiliated so thoroughly by a species they spent years calling primitive. The Council is debating formal sanctions, though I suspect those sanctions matter far less now than the simple fact that every delegation in that chamber understands humanity is no longer a species that can be dismissed or exploited without consequence." I returned to the Council chamber myself 2 weeks later, called to testify formally about the engagements at Ashgrove, Corvale, and Earth's defense perimeter. Walking into that familiar circular hall felt entirely different from my previous visit, the atmosphere charged with a tension that had nothing to do with indifference. Delegates who had once refused to meet my eyes now watched me with a careful, assessing attention that told me humanity's position within this room had fundamentally shifted. The Vren delegate was notably absent from this session, replaced by a junior representative who spoke with none of his predecessors' tired confidence. When my turn came to address the chamber, I found myself speaking not with the frustrated urgency that had defined my earlier testimony, but with a steady clarity born from having witnessed exactly what my species was capable of when finally pushed past the limits of patient endurance. 6 years ago, humanity joined this council hoping to earn respect through patience and diplomacy, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the silent chamber. We watched our colonies suffer while this body debated technicalities rather than protecting a member species from clear, repeated aggression. We were told our concerns did not meet the proper legal standard for intervention. We were told to wait for dialogue that never produced meaningful protection. I paused, looking around the chamber at faces that, for the first time since I had taken this seat, actually seemed to be listening. We stopped waiting, I continued, not because we sought conflict, but because we finally understood that this council would never protect us unless we demonstrated we no longer needed its protection to survive. What happened at Earth's defense perimeter was not an act of aggression. It was the direct consequence of 6 years spent watching this chamber fail every single test of its stated principles. The silence that followed carried a different weight than the indifferent stillness I remembered from my first testimony. Several delegates exchanged uncertain glances, clearly recalculating their understanding of humanity's place among the Council's established powers. The Alaxian ambassador, who had studied her datapad with detached boredom during the Halvorn Reach session, now watched me with an expression I could only describe as careful respect, the kind reserved for someone whose capabilities had just been dramatically and permanently revised. In the months that followed, The galaxy's understanding of humanity changed in ways I could not have imagined during those early years of quiet, patient diplomacy. Delegations that had once ignored our representatives now sought private meetings, eager to understand a species capable of dismantling an established empire's military doctrine through adaptability and coordination rather than raw technological superiority. The Vren Empire, humiliated and diplomatically isolated, entered a period of internal upheaval as their leadership faced consequences for a miscalculation that had cost them both military strength and standing among their allies. Grace Whitfield was invited to address the full council directly, an honor no human official had previously received, where she outlined humanity's vision for a revised framework of protection for smaller, newer species who found themselves vulnerable to exactly the kind of exploitation Earth had endured for 6 years. Several delegations, chastened by watching an empire's downfall unfold in real time, supported reforms that would have been unthinkable before humanity's defense of Earth demonstrated the cost of ignoring a pattern of aggression until it produced consequences too large to dismiss. Amelia Ford returned to civilian life eventually, though she remained involved in advising the authority on colony defense preparation, her quiet resolve now recognized as an essential part of the strategic foundation that had protected Earth. Sophie Ainsley continued her service aboard coordination vessels, carrying forward the same steady competence that had guided humanity through 3 of the most significant engagements in our history. Nathan Ellery was promoted to oversee broader fleet strategy, his calm, adaptable approach to command becoming a model studied by newer officers entering humanity's expanding defense forces. I remained at the council station, my role shifting from a diplomat pleading quietly for recognition to a representative whose testimony carried genuine weight in shaping how the council approached questions of protection and accountability for its smaller member species. I thought often during those months about Ethan Cole and the 4,000 names from Halvorn Reach, understanding that nothing about humanity's new standing among the stars could undo what had been lost before we finally stopped waiting for permission to defend ourselves. But I understood something else as well, something Amelia Ford had put into words during our conversation weeks before Earth's defense perimeter became the site of humanity's defining moment. Fear, she told me, feels different once it finally points in the right direction. Grief, reshaped carefully rather than allowed to consume everything it touches, can become the foundation for something that protects others from suffering the same loss. Humanity did not seek the conflict that reshaped our standing among the Council's ancient powers. We sought only the same protection every other member species claimed as their fundamental right, and we absorbed insult after insult, loss after loss, while waiting patiently for a system to honor its own stated principles. When that patience finally reached its limit, what emerged was not simple aggression, but the full weight of a species that had spent generations learning, through its own complicated history, exactly what resilience and adaptability could accomplish when finally allowed to answer harm with decisive, unwavering resolve. The Galactic Council learned, in the end, that Earth's quiet endurance had never been weakness, it had been patience, carefully measured, waiting only for the moment when patience alone could no longer protect what mattered most. And when that moment finally arrived, the stars themselves seemed to shift beneath the weight of what humanity had become, a species no longer defined by the modest, uncertain newcomers who once sat quietly in that circular chamber, but by the unshakable resolve that emerged when a people finally decided that our survival, our colonies, and our future would never again depend on someone else's permission to protect them. I still carry the names from Halvorn Reach with me, and I suspect I always will, but I carry them now not as a symbol of loss the Council chose to ignore, but as the foundation of everything humanity became determined never to allow again. Earth's wrath, once unleashed, did not fade quietly back into patient silence. It became the new and permanent understanding that the stars, and every power among them, would carry forward for as long as humanity remained among them. The Council learned too late that some patience, once broken, does not bend back into quiet compliance. It becomes instead the unshakable resolve of a species that will never again wait for permission to protect what is theirs.